Washington was living its usual political life. The streets around the White House were filled with journalists. The cameras of the major TV channels recorded every movement, and work was in full swing inside the administration. Today's meeting in the Oval Office promised to be important. Key issues of national security and the economy were on the agenda. President Donald Trump, surrounded by his advisors and ministers, was preparing to discuss strategic decisions that were to determine the immediate future of the country. The atmosphere in the spacious room was tense but focused, filled with leading members of the media. They sat in a press area, notepads and tape recorders at the ready. Among them was Caitlin Collins, a CNN reporter known for her aggressive rhetoric against Trump. Always looking for ways to attack the president, her posts on Twitter and Facebook left no doubt. She despised his policies and took every opportunity to make him look bad. Trump knew it. He was acutely aware of who was sitting in front of him, but he maintained his composure. As advisors read reports on the economy, trade talks, and the border, he listened intently, nodding occasionally and making notes on his papers. He stood tall, projecting absolute confidence. Caitlin sat in the third row, holding a notepad in her hand and occasionally glancing at the president, as if waiting for her moment to strike. She knew she would have an opportunity to ask a question, and she planned to make the most of it. In her head, she was already lining up sharp phrases that would sound like an accusation, generate a headline, and be shared on social media. But so far Trump has given no indication that he notices her presence. The White House secretary, who was standing nearby, announced a list of topics up for discussion. Among them were tax policy reforms, measures to ensure security on the southern border, and new sanctions against countries that threaten U.S. interests. The meeting proceeded strictly according to plan, with each speaker speaking to the point without dragging out the discussion. Trump asked occasional follow-up questions, pausing between his lines. He looked calm, but his gaze was intense, suggesting he was in complete control. Caitlin watched him carefully, trying to catch the moment when she could put in her word. As the formal portion of the meeting came to an end, the White House press secretary announced, "Now journalists have the opportunity to ask questions to the president." Trump looked up at the crowd. He knew this was always the most interesting moment for the press. Journalists whispered among themselves, raising their hands, hoping to attract attention. And just as he was about to select the first reporter to ask a question, the sharp voice of Caitlin Collins disrupted the general order. "Mr. President," she began loudly, without waiting to be given the floor, "how do you comment on the allegations that your recent statements on the economy do not correspond to reality?" Trump slowly turned his gaze to her. A tense silence fell over the room. No one expected her to decide to act so forcefully from the very beginning. "Excuse me, but what exactly do you mean?" he asked calmly, folding his hands on the table. Caitlin leaned forward slightly, ready to follow up her attack. "Your economic advisors claim that the current unemployment rate in the country is falling thanks to your measures. But independent sources say the opposite, that your policies are leading to a crisis and that unemployment data is actually inflated to create a false impression of your administration's success." Trump thought for a moment, then chuckled. "Independent sources? Do you mean CNN?" A wave of muffled laughter ran through the room. Some journalists glanced furtively at each other, while others continued to write down every word. Caitlin, however, did not back down. "I mean the research of leading economic analysts," she replied, lifting her chin. "Are you really saying that they are all wrong and that only your data is correct?" Trump leaned back, pausing. "You see, Caitlin, the problem isn't the data. It's the way your network presents it. You take the numbers that benefit you and ignore the rest. For example, why doesn't CNN report that American manufacturing employment is at its highest level in a decade?" Collins frowned but didn't give in. "Because this data is not complete." "Complete?" Trump asked. "You know what's not complete? Your reporting." Muffled laughter was heard in the hall. Trump leaned closer to the microphone. "Let's be honest. Your network hasn't been doing journalism for a long time. You don't ask questions, you put on plays. You don't seek the truth, you create it." Caitlin tried to object, but he raised his hand, stopping her. We are talking about the real problems of the country now. But it seems that you are only concerned about the possibility of causing a scandal. She pressed her lips together, realizing he wasn't going to let her have this discussion on her own terms. But you know what? Trump continued. You'll have another chance to discuss it. Just not here. Everyone froze. Caitlin narrowed her eyes. What do you mean? Trump leaned forward slightly and said clearly and calmly. You are in my house. And if you came here not for facts, but for provocation, then this is not the place for you. The audience gasped. The journalists froze, realizing what had just happened. Caitlin paled, but still tried to maintain her confidence. Trump nodded towards the security guards. Please show Miss Collins out. The guards immediately approached her. She opened her mouth to object, but realized that she had lost. The room watched as Caitlin Collins, known for her sharp attacks on the president, found herself for the first time in a position where she had nothing to say. She rose slowly from her seat, throwing an angry look at Trump, but he was already looking towards another journalist as if the incident was of no consequence to him. And that was just the beginning. Because now he was going to show the entire country exactly how CNN had been spreading fake news about his administration. The silence in the Oval Office lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Caitlin Collins sat with the air of someone who knows she's right. Her lips were pressed tightly together, and her eyes were determined not to back down. Despite having just been publicly put in her place, she was not about to give in. As a seasoned CNN journalist, she was accustomed to controversy, and even more so to creating controversy. She knew that any attack on Trump would immediately become a headline, and the louder her question, the more the liberal media would pick it up. Mr. President, she said, a hint of sarcasm in her voice, if you believe the media manipulates the facts, then perhaps we should talk about your own misinformation? Trump raised his eyebrows slightly. An interesting statement, he replied, leaning back in his chair with a slight grin. And what disinformation are we talking about this time? Collins pretended to look over her notes, but everyone knew it was just a prepared gesture. She looked up and spoke louder than necessary, clearly wanting her voice to register well on camera. Your claims about the integrity of the 2020 elections have been repeatedly called false. Fact-checkers, independent journalists, and even former members of your administration confirm that you had no real evidence of fraud. Yet you continue to claim otherwise. Isn't that disinformation? She crossed her arms, waiting for a reaction. Silence fell in the hall again. Trump nodded slowly, tapping his fingers thoughtfully on the table. He didn't look flustered. Quite the opposite, in fact, his gaze became more focused, his voice extremely calm. Good question, Caitlin, he finally said. But let me ask you a counter question. If you have a problem with my statements, then why are you so unconcerned about the lies your own channel has been spreading for years? The journalists tensed up. You talk about fact-checkers and independent journalists, but we all know how that works. Independent? He chuckled. These are people who work for publications that have received millions of dollars in funding from structures connected to the Democrats. Am I right? Caitlin tried to say something, but Trump raised his hand, stopping her. Let me remind you who exactly is constantly spreading fakes. For example, CNN claimed that I called all migrants criminals, although I clearly only spoke about cartels and human traffickers. You, of course, took the phrase out of context and blew the scandal out of proportion. Was this honest journalism? Collins opened her mouth again, but Trump didn't let her get a word in. Let's move on. Your network actively supported the story of Russian interference in the 2016 election. For 3 years, you didn't care that there was no evidence. You simply repeated the lie because it suited you and your bosses. But when the Mueller investigation showed that it was all a fabrication, CNN quietly hushed it up, without even apologizing to millions of viewers. Is that honest journalism? Some of the journalists exchanged glances. The atmosphere was getting tense. Or let's remember how you said that the BLM protests were mostly peaceful, while American cities were burning and people were losing their businesses. Am I right in thinking that when buildings are burning and people are dying, that can be called a peaceful protest? Caitlin Collins began to lose confidence. She was used to her questions not being answered harshly, but now the US president was simply trashing her in front of the entire room. Wait, I'm not done, Trump said, glancing at the journalists, who were no longer hiding their interest in what was happening. You recently claimed that I had a secret plan to overturn the election. But then it turned out that was another CNN fantasy, based on the opinions of anonymous sources. But your network presented it as an established fact. Caitlin froze. She felt the flashes of cameras catching her confusion. Her career had been built on attacking Trump, on ridiculing him, on constant innuendo that created an image of a president in chaos. But now he had turned the tables, and she was the one at the center of a humiliating revelation. Trump leaned a little closer to the microphone. You want to talk about disinformation, Caitlin? Then let's be honest. You've lied about my administration for years, you've taken words out of context, you've ignored the real successes of my policies. And the funny thing is, every time CNN has been proven wrong, none of you has apologized. The journalists continued to listen in silence. Even Trump's most ardent critics understood that he was now in control of the situation. Now let me ask you a question, he said, looking directly at Collins. Do you want to be seen as a journalist or as an activist? Because journalism is about finding the truth, and activism is about propaganda. Caitlin didn't know what to answer. She always considered herself a journalist, but Trump just exposed her true role to everyone, a political activist hiding under the guise of a reporter. Her face flushed slightly. She opened her mouth, but knew that any word she said now would be used against her. Trump chuckled. I think we both know the answer. A tense silence reigned in the hall. The journalists in the room realized they were witnessing a unique moment. One of the loudest voices in the liberal media was publicly exposed and exposed for hypocrisy right in the Oval Office. Caitlin knew her attempt to attack Trump had failed. But the worst was yet to come. Because now Trump was going to show the entire country exactly how CNN had been spreading fake news about his administration. A tense silence fell over the Oval Office. No one dared interrupt, not even the journalists who usually happily supported their colleagues in the liberal media. Everyone understood that Caitlin Collins was now in the eye of a hurricane, and that hurricane was named Donald Trump. The president leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest. He watched Collins carefully as she tried to maintain her composure, but her posture told a different story. Her shoulders were tense, her fingers gripping her pen so tightly that her knuckles were white. So, Caitlin, Trump began slowly, with a slight grin. You say I'm spreading disinformation. Let's figure out who's the real master of this business. Collins took a deep breath. She couldn't let him dictate the conversation. Mr. President, she said forcefully, I ask questions because my job is to get to the truth. Trump chuckled. True? He asked, as if tasting the word. Then, Caitlin, tell me, why is your truth so often a lie? He turned sharply to his assistant, who was already holding a tablet in his hands. Give us a little insight into CNN journalism, Trump said, nodding toward the screen. Collins leaned forward slightly, unsure of what exactly awaited her. Her own Twitter message appeared on the screen. Donald Trump is violating democratic norms. He refuses to admit defeat, trying to hold on to power at any cost. Trump nodded. This is your statement, right? Collins pressed her lips together but nodded. And what did you base your decision on? She collected her thoughts. Based on statements from independent experts and facts that showed that your actions could threaten. Stop, Trump interrupted, holding up his palm. Facts? Caitlin, the only fact here is that what you're saying has nothing to do with reality. He waved his hand and the following message appeared on the screen. CNN sources. Trump considered using military to overturn election. The president leaned forward. Caitlin, your sources claimed that I wanted to use the military to stay in power. This was presented as an established fact. You personally supported this version, stating that this is a signal for dictatorship. A deathly silence reigned in the hall. But it turned out to be a lie. Not a single piece of evidence. Not a single piece of paper. Not a single witness. Nothing. Just another fake from CNN. Collins tensed. I covered information provided by reliable sources. Trump raised his eyebrows. Reliable? And when it turned out to be a lie, did you apologize? Publish a refutation? She didn't answer. Of course not, he continued with a shrug. Because CNN's goal has never been to tell the truth. CNN's goal is to attack me at all costs. He turned back to the screen. Now there is a video. Collins, sitting in a CNN studio, spoke to the camera. Trump's claims of election fraud are baseless conspiracy theories. There is no evidence that widespread fraud occurred. Trump smirked and turned to face her. Caitlin, is that you? She didn't answer again. Then tell me, how did it happen that later in several states massive violations of vote counting were revealed? What happened to your truth? The journalists around her were exchanging glances. This was becoming increasingly humiliating for Collins. She straightened up, deciding to make one last attempt to save face. Mr. President, but independent investigations. Trump cut her off sharply. Are you talking about independent investigations, again? The same investigations that spent 3 years trying to prove Russian collusion, that didn't exist? Collins pressed her lips together. Caitlin, you can try to justify yourself all you want, but the facts speak for themselves. Your statements are lies. Your sources are a myth. Your journalism is just dirty propaganda. She was at a dead end. But Trump is not done yet. You know what the difference is between you and me? He said, looking straight into her eyes. When I say something, my words can be checked. But when CNN publishes another scoop, it disappears within a week because it turns out to be fake. Collins made no further attempt to object. Trump folded his hands in front of him and calmly added, and that's why you're no longer a journalist. You're an activist working for the Democratic Party. The silence in the hall became even heavier. Even liberal media journalists knew Collins had lost. Trump, feeling that he had been hit in the heart, leaned closer to the microphone and uttered the final phrase, which was a real blow to Collins' reputation. Now, Caitlin, I think it's time for you to leave this room. She winced. What? You've used this platform for propaganda for too long, and I won't stand for it any longer. Security, escort Miss Collins out. Muffled sighs were heard in the hall. 2 security guards silently approached the journalist, gesturing that it was time for her to leave. She jumped to her feet, her face burning with anger and humiliation. This is a suppression of free speech, she shouted, but her voice wavered. Trump just chuckled. No, this is the White House's defense against fake news. Reporters watched as Collins, one of Trump's most vocal opponents in the media, walked out of the Oval Office, humiliated and crushed. But that was not the end. Because now Trump was going to show the entire country exactly how CNN and media like it had been spreading lies for years. A heavy silence fell over the room as Caitlin Collins realized she had lost. Her face was flushed with humiliation, her hands were shaking, but she tried her best to maintain a mask of professionalism. But the truth was clear. Her own weapons, the sharp questions, the accusations, the distortions of the facts, had now been turned against her. The journalists were silent, watching what was happening. No one dared to intervene or try to support her, because everyone understood that Trump had not simply exposed another manipulation of the media. He had done it in such a way that no one had any doubts about the correctness of his words. The president, sensing the intensity of the moment, paused. Then he slowly turned to the screen, which still showed Collins's old tweets and posts, exposed in the last few minutes. He nodded to an aide, and a new image appeared on the screen, footage of CNN coverage of her. Let's see how the truth has changed as performed by our independent journalist, Trump said, folding his arms across his chest. The screen flashed with video recordings. First clip, Collins on CNN, with a straight face, declares that Russian interference in the 2016 election is a proven fact, and that Trump used his ties to the Kremlin to win. Next shot, CNN reports several years later, in which the anchors, gritted their teeth in acknowledging reality, report that the investigation found no clear evidence of collusion. It's interesting, Caitlin, Trump said, looking at her. When your network was pushing these lies, you didn't even question it. You went on air and said it was proven, that it was just a matter of time. Where is your apology to the millions of viewers you misinformed? Collins remained silent. But Trump had no intention of stopping. The following fragment appeared on the screen. She's in the CNN studio, confidently saying, Donald Trump called neo-Nazis in Charlottesville very fine people. The video cuts to actual footage of Trump speaking, where he condemns radicals on both sides, bluntly stating, I am not talking about neo-Nazis, because they should be completely condemned. Trump chuckled and turned to Collins. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? He asked. You took my words out of context and made a monster out of me. And now that the truth is out, you're silent again. Caitlin Collins clenched her jaw. She wanted to say something, but she knew that every word she said would only make the situation worse. Next video. Trump's claims of election fraud in 2020 are completely baseless. There is no evidence of any irregularities, Collins said on CNN. Footage then emerges of hearings in several states where election officials confirm the existence of thousands of questionable votes, double voting, and problems with counting. Where is your journalistic integrity here, Caitlin? Trump asked, looking her over. You were told the investigation was ongoing, but CNN has already declared it a conspiracy theory. Some of the journalists in the room began to mutter among themselves. Even those who supported Collins understood that you can't argue with the facts. And most importantly, Trump continued, your network, Caitlin, has been saying for 4 years that I'm a dictator, that I'm going to destroy democracy. But what happened? He paused dramatically. Who is in power now? Silence. Biden. Right. He looked straight at Collins, who sat with her fingers clasped together, staring into space. So where is your dictatorship, Caitlin? If I really were the monster you described, would you be sitting here now? Writing whatever you want on your social media? He waved his hand towards the door. Now it's time for you to go. Collins' head snapped up. You can't just. I can't, Trump replied calmly. And I do. The White House is not a stage for CNN performances. The guards came closer. You can continue your work, Caitlin. Just not here. We will no longer tolerate blatant fakes within these walls. Collins stood up, her face flushed. She looked at her colleagues, but no one made an attempt to intercede. She grabbed the notebook and headed sharply towards the exit. Trump watched her go, then turned to the rest of the reporters. Now that the circus is over, does anyone have any substantive questions? Some journalists fidgeted, but most remained silent. On this day, it became clear, Trump will no longer allow fake news to rule the White House. After Caitlin Collins left the Oval Office, there was a tense silence in the room. No reporter dared ask another question first. The atmosphere in the room seemed still tinged with the aftermath of Collins's humiliating moment. Trump slowly looked around the room. He saw a mixture of surprise, fear, and even respect on the faces of the journalists present. They realized that the rules of the game had changed. What had just happened was a signal to everyone. The White House would no longer silently tolerate biased attacks from the liberal media. Well, he said, breaking the silence, I hope that now we can move on to discussing real issues concerning our country? Or does someone else want to try to use this platform for a cheap political game? Nobody answered. Trump nodded to his aide, who steered the conversation back to the scheduled agenda. The questions became more measured. The reporters no longer allowed themselves to attack the president the way Collins had. Their questions were now more careful, more measured. The press conference continued for some time, but it was already clear Trump had emerged victorious from this fight. As soon as the White House meeting ended, news of the Caitlin Collins scandal began to spread rapidly across all media channels. CNN, naturally, was the first to air a breaking news report, with anchors indignantly discussing the incident. Collins appeared on air trying to play the victim, declaring that there was a blow to freedom of the press today. This was an act of suppression of journalism, she said indignantly on air. The Trump administration has shown that it does not tolerate uncomfortable questions. However, even among the journalistic community, not everyone took her words with sympathy. Some colleagues understood that she herself provoked this conflict and got exactly what she was going for consciously. Fox News and other conservative outlets presented the situation differently, airing clips of Collins' questions and old social media posts, proving that she was indeed engaged in political propaganda, not journalism. Social media was in an uproar. The hashtag #TrumpOwnsCNN became the #1 trending topic on Twitter. Thousands of users posted clips from the press conference, memes of Collins's confused face, and her previous accusations against Trump. The comments were divided. Trump supporters: "This is how you deal with fake news. Journalism died a long time ago, and Trump just reminded them that the truth still matters. Collins got what she deserved." Trump opponents: "It was an act of dictatorship. He's just afraid of tough questions. Trump is destroying freedom of the press." But despite the protests of the liberal media, one thing was clear: public opinion was beginning to change. This incident had an impact not only on the journalistic community, but also on the political arena. The White House press service made an official statement, in which it emphasized that Trump does not prohibit journalists from asking questions, but will not allow the White House to be used as a platform for spreading fake news. Republican senators supported the president, with some even openly declaring that it was long past time to end CNN's journalistic terrorism. "Freedom of speech does not mean freedom to lie," one senator said in an interview. Kate Collins and her colleagues have used their positions to manipulate public opinion for too long. Trump has simply reminded them that the truth still matters. At the same time, Democrats and their media allies used the situation to criticize Trump, accusing him of suppressing free speech, demanding an investigation, and even hinting that such actions could affect the upcoming election. After the incident, the White House press office changed its policy. Now, journalists caught asking biased or outright false questions could have their accreditation revoked. At the next press conference, the journalists were more careful. They no longer allowed themselves to make crude attacks, and their questions became less provocative. Trump got his way. He put the media in its place. Journalists realized that from now on, every lie they tell could be exposed right before the eyes of millions of people. The White House was no longer an arena for fake news, and it became one of Trump's most resounding victories over the liberal media in his entire political career.